liaisons from the Just Transitions Subcommittee. Unfortunately, Sam, is traveling, and it doesn't look like we have Callie Fishburne, who's our other liaison from that subcommittee, on yet. So unless she joins, we will skip over introductions of those new members. The first kind of order of business is to seek a volunteer to do note-taking responsibilities for this meeting. Does anybody feel inclined to step up for note-taking?
I will do that.
Thank you. Is that Bram?
It is Bram.
Thank you.
Inspired and intimidated by what a good job Andrea did with last meeting's minutes.
Thank you. And so our next step is to approve the minutes from the last meeting in May. Has everyone had a chance to review them, and are there any edits to the minutes? Absent that, do we want to approve the minutes? Do we need an official vote or a thumbs up indicate? Okay, we will consider the minutes from May 16th approved. And moving down the agenda, the first item on our agenda, the first substantive item, is Brian has agreed to kind of provide an overview of what we call the business as usual scenario. This is kind of in response to the conversation we had last month when we were going through progress related to the action strategies pathways recommended in the last climate action plan. And there was really a desire to understand, well, great to see that those are moving forward, but where are we with emissions, and where do we expect to be in the near term? And how does that guide our work when we look at our upcoming Global Warming Solutions Act obligations as we look to update the climate action plan this time around? So Brian's agreed to give a quick kind of overview there. This is somewhat related to what was presented at the Climate Council back in January.
Okay. 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 I think that is it. If folks can just confirm that you're looking at.
Looks good.
Okay. Melissa asked me if I could do this update. This is a updated version of a presentation that I gave to the Climate Council in January. So this might be familiar to some of you. There are some slight updates that I'll point out. But basically, we're just going to talk a little bit about the low emissions analysis platform. That's the platform that we use to implement the Vermont Pathways model, which is actually the model of the economy-wide Vermont emissions. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the baseline update that we undertook as part of the buildings and thermal energy analysis. And then next steps, which is primarily the plans that we have to be able to update the baseline in support of the work of the Climate Council going forward. So for those of you that don't know, we are utilizing this low emissions analysis platform, or LEAP, that's developed by the Stockholm Environment Institute. As the bullets say, integrated scenario-based modeling tool. The people that we work with there, Taylor Bennington in particular, which some of you may have seen on other meetings, was the primary support for this. And Taylor's great. It's like, basically, he says, this is like a very, very fancy Excel spreadsheet. You put in assumptions regarding energy consumption, production, resource and extraction in transportation, in buildings, in agriculture, all the sectors, also like non-energy sectors as well. And the platform will calculate what emissions are, both greenhouse gas and other types of emissions as well, if you're interested in, based upon the assumptions that you put in regarding like what your transportation sector looks like, what your buildings sector looks like, how many buildings you have, what kind they are, what do they use for heat and hot water, for cooling, all of those things. And it's a very powerful tool. the calculations, they handle all of the energy emissions and also costs that are associated with all of the, the economy as you are modeling it. And you use these spreadsheet-like expressions, like you've seen in Excel, very complicated ones, to specify time-varying data. And you can also develop a particular scenario. So we'll be talking about the baseline primarily, like what we expect to have happen based upon information that we have, both near historical and then forecasts from various resources. But it also will say, if we do this, for example, if we implement a clean heat standard, or if we want to, pursue this type of a policy, for example, before we pass the ACC2 and ACT regulations, that was in the mitigation model. So what would happen if Vermont adopted those things? That's a scenario. There's a number of scenarios that are already built into the Vermont Pathways model, which is on the LEAP platform. And the idea is that we would be able to develop more based upon, what people are interested in seeing it looks like. And I think I'll say right now, it's like, this tool is like the best that we have right now for projecting emissions. It is not a perfect tool, and no tool is. But the reason why we bought it is two reasons. One, it's very transparent. It allows us to see what all the model does exactly, and also allows us to get into the guts of the model, unlike some previous models that were used in support of the Comprehensive Energy Plan, which required the consultant to do the work. It was proprietary platforms and kind of a black box model. And this isn't really like that. But the reason we use it is like, you can do this baseline and then you build these scenarios, and it's really good at saying, as compared to the baseline, if you do this thing, here's the differences that you could see. It's not terrible as a forecast tool. It's probably as good as the information that goes into it, but its real strength to me is to be able to say, let's do this comparison. If you say this is what we think is going to happen, and then if we do this other thing, what changes? LEAP and Vermont Pathways, I think, is a really good tool for that, and I'm glad we have it. So this just lays out, the one you're looking at now just lays out where we started with this. It was first to build in the support the 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan, and then you saw the Vermont Pathways report that was used as part of developing the Climate Action Plan. And then, as I mentioned, in last year, we asked the contractor, then the SEI is a subcontractor to Energy Futures Group, to do this analysis of the building thermal energy sector policies. And we use this platform to be able to support that work as well. So going back to the Pathways 2.0 back in 2021, these are the gray bars are the Global Warming Solutions Act target years. And then the orange bars are what in version 2.11, which was the version that supported that 2.0 report. This is what the baseline emissions were forecasted or predicted to be. These were the results, I guess is the best way to say it, from LEAP based upon the assumptions that we put in for the baseline. And so as you can see, total emissions and I have updated this, we've been talking about 2025 and 2030, but because those dates in the act are January 1, it's actually calendar year 2024 and 2029 emissions. And where we've been working at, when we started this conversation back in 2021, it was like, yes, it looks like the model is saying we will be just under the 2024 emissions, but we're certainly not on target for what we've been saying are the 2030 target. And I'll keep using that nomenclature, but it's important to note that it's actually calendar 2029. So between 2001 and 2003, as I mentioned, we asked the contractor to do an update of the baseline of the, what other people call business as usual, to incorporate things that had happened between, 2021 and 2023. The primary one that I'll call out, but not the only one, is that we did take the adoption of advanced clean cars and to an advanced clean trucks out of the mitigation scenario, because it became, we enacted the regulations to be able to undertake that. And so those now result in additional emissions in the transportation sector that we weren't seeing before in the baseline. There are other changes that I can get into, but primarily because of the update for regulations and different trajectories for assumptions for trajectories for in the building sector and other sectors, you can see that this is the orange line that you saw before, and then the blue line is what the updated version of the baseline was saying. And again, it's, we are on track for, calendar year 2024, 2025, Joe Boring Solutions Act. Better, but still needs some work to achieve the 2030 reductions. The dashed lines here are just a linear projection to the 2050 value. And then you can see again, the baseline says we do make progress as compared to previously, but still more work to do in order to be able to meet these targets. And this is economy-wide. Unfortunately, what happened in the analysis in 2024 is that, in the 2023 analysis, is the contractor built in an adjustment in the agricultural sector for to make it aligned with the carbon budget study that was led by folks from UVM to adjust the emissions from the agricultural sector. So they put in an adjustment factor into the emissions that were coming out of LEAP that basically cut the agriculture sector emissions in half. And, I think it was understood why they did that, but that's not aligned with the way that the inventory tracks those emissions. And so what we needed to do afterwards, and this is where the yellow line is what happens to baseline emissions when you adjust the agriculture emissions, the agricultural sector emissions, to be aligned with the way the inventory counts those emissions. So in 2024, you can see now the yellow line is it's basically equivalent, and I have a table later on. It is just under the 2025 goal, but then the story basically remains the same in 2030 and then out to 2050. And I always bring this slide. I brought this slide in because it was, for people who are familiar with that had read the buildings report and saw the results, they were used to seeing the emissions baseline as depicted by the blue bars. And this is a more accurate representation of that comparison as compared to the inventory. So I had a table, and here it is. So here are the sector emissions, and I don't need to leave this on for very long. It's a lot of numbers here, but basically what it shows is what the bars were showing, that for the GWSA 2025 target, we are just under 13,000 metric tons of CO2e, and that we're over projected for 2030. And I wanted to just take a moment to talk about how, the accuracy or the reliability of the model. And, this is to be able to address some concerns that Jared shared with us earlier in the year, where there was the model's not perfect, and no model, of course, will be perfect. But what I'm trying to show here is that as you move forward in time, even though we know what historical emissions are here, they're actually in this column 3, and the model was not doing, maybe wasn't so great in the earlier years, but as we get closer to where we are in the present, its difference between the pathways baseline emissions and what the actual emissions were get a little bit better. And that's helpful to know. The numbers, if the numbers were exactly on target, I certainly would be skeptical, because there isn't going to be any model that's going to, that, you know, will exactly match what reality is. But we think over time, you can say it's, you know, it definitely adjusts to become more aligned with what the inventory emissions are. And if we just look a little bit closer, there's a lot of numbers on this table. The top part here in blue, this is basically what you just saw, that over time, the difference between the pathways baseline and the inventory closes down between 2015 and 2020, but that the difference in the two sectors that are the largest, RCI, which is in green here, and transportation, which is kind of an orangey or a salmon pink number, they're actually over time have been pretty close. The pathways has been under. That's true. It's under for all of these, but it's actually pretty close. Other sectors, so industrial process, you know, here 14.6% low, waste management 22% low. Yeah, those need to be fixed, and we're going to adjust, you know, update and adjust the model for all of these things. But some of these sectors are smaller percentages of the total. So again, not to say that that the review that we got was invalid. Of course, it was very valid, and of course, we want the model to be as close to representative of, you know, what actually happened as possible, and to be able to make it as robust a forecasting tool as we can. You know, but we think it's pretty good. And like I said before, with any model's got its shortcomings and its strengths. And I think the things that I talked about with LEAP and Vermont Pathways, the fact that it's transparent, that we can get into the guts, we can manipulate the inputs and outputs in ways that we couldn't do with a proprietary model, that its power in being able to compare a baseline to scenarios that we can build to be able to do this what if type of analysis is really helpful. So going forward, we're actually working with SEI directly, the people that built the model and are the owners of the LEAP software. We're going to engage them in a contract, probably be a 4-year contract, to be able to do a few things. One, to provide both the A&R CAO and PSD staff with support for the existing version of the model. They sent us through a training, and they've been excellent. And certainly both at the Climate Action Office and in PSD, we have built competence with being able to use this model. In particular, Claire McElvany at PSD has done some additional work in support of the regional planning commissions with outputs from this model. So we can get around in here and we can do a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of things that are very sophisticated. And it's really great to be able to have the contractor on call. They've actually been providing us with some level of no-cost support when we have questions. But we want to get them on contract so they can do that for us. We can call them and, you know, either get help with a problem that we're having with a model, to be able to do minor updates, to be able to produce additional, you know, outputs, figures, tables, or things like that that might be above our capability to be able to do right now. We also want to have them on board to be able to help us with updating the model with more recent information that's available. A lot of this information, particularly go forward information, is from forecasts from other sources, like, you know, federal government, from the EIC, from Belco. A lot of people have information about what is the baseline going forward? What do we think is going to happen in each of these sectors? And there's newer information available now, of course, than there was when the model was last updated. So we want some help with them, from SEI, to be able to do that work. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we expect that there's going to be some capacity to be able to add scenarios that may not be in the model right now into the model in support of decision-making that the Climate Council needs to make for the update to the Climate Action Plan. This is the de rigueur thank you and for more information slide. And I think we can take any questions that people have.
Thanks, Brian. That's very helpful refresher on the data. Any questions from subcommittee members on the business as usual scenario?
Jared, go ahead.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Melissa. First, I just want to thank you for the work that you, Brian, have done, and any work that SEI has done to make further improvements to the Vermont Pathways model, incorporating the requested feedback and improvements back from January around aligning the agricultural emissions methodology to match that of the inventory. That was a clear need, and I think that's great that that improvement was made. And I think that there's additional improvements that need to be made, and I appreciate that is planned, especially given the additional data that we have since 2020, especially related to transportation and thermal sector fuels that go through 2023 and beyond now. In terms of what all this means, I think that one of the really important things to pause on and have appropriate appreciation for is that, and we may need to go back to some of these slides. I tried to write them down quickly. But my recollection, Brian, is that the difference between the updated Vermont Pathways model, the most recent one, and what it was estimating for emissions, statewide emissions in 2020 versus what the inventory reported as statewide emissions for 2020. It was a difference of 320,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, whereas the estimate in the updated pathways relative to the 2025, the January 1st, 2025 or 2024 annual emissions obligation under the Global Warming Solutions Act was, I think you characterized it as basically equivalent or 130,000 tons under. And I just want to pause to note, or maybe 13,000 tons under, not even 130,000 tons. And I just want to pause to note that given the discrepancy between the inventory and the model, I don't think that we should have confidence that that coming in just under is actually going to happen. It's a very, very small number compared to the size of discrepancy and error between this model and what the inventory is showing. So all of that to say, continued refinements and improvements based on, yes, appreciating that the ag sector emissions are now accounted properly per the inventory methodology. But this does not provide much confidence at all that we are on track to meet the legal responsibility to ensure that we come in under the 2025 requirement by the end of this year, if what the model is showing is 13,000 tons under, and there's a discrepancy between that pathways model and the inventory that is, much, much higher.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, we need to update the model, and after we do an update to the baseline, maybe that number will change and maybe it won't. I think, everybody has been saying, like, the real operative number for policy implementation or the operative date is not the 2025 target. We are in the the first target year. And also it's like, I guess, as you know, Jared, like this would never be perfect. I think we're trying to make it as good as it can be. But I think even when that difference between the pathways 2025 number and the GWSA number was larger, 130, 150, within the limits of the error that we know it was in the forecast that was built into it anyway, I certainly always looked at it as like, well, it's going to be very close. And I couldn't tell you one way or another. And I'll repeat what I said before. This is a really good tool, all right? But its real power is in saying, as compared to this baseline, if we do these other things, here's what we get. It's not terrible at doing, here's exactly where we're going to be going. But there are other tools that we could use that might be better at that, but that they have their own shortcomings. So I think you're exactly right, Jared. When you said at your presentation, when say it's like, this doesn't give me great confidence that we're on track for 25 to 25. Basically, these numbers are equal, and we can't tell. And there's no policy that we're going to implement between now and December that's going to change the trajectory of what actual emissions would be when we finally get through the inventory and find out what they were. I agree with all of that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And just last call for any additional comments. I know we're going to lose David shortly, and so I do want to make sure we're staying on track with the agenda. So yeah, I appreciate the back and forth, and Jared, I think you put it well. Continued refinement of the model is needed, ongoing adjustments there to improve the accuracy. And of course, as Brian constantly reminds me, it's not a predictor of GWSA compliance. That's not what the tool is intended to do. But I did think it was important for the committee to get that high level grounding of where are emissions trending, and most importantly, where are there significant gaps, and where is cross-sector mitigation's focus going to be most useful, again, as we look to 2030, the 2029 emissions year for that 2030 compliance date, recognizing that we are midway through 2024 right now. So, as with this as our jumping off point, we were going to move on to looking at the guidance that the subcommittee has provided, that the steering committee has provided to the subcommittees to kind of govern our work over the next 3 months. And I'm hoping, again, apologies for that getting out a little bit late to you all. This was, I think, sent yesterday. I'm hoping folks have had a chance to review it. And David's here again to kind of help support us in our discussion and answer questions. The guidance, I don't know, are you able to bring up?
I'm happy to share my screen with it too, Melissa, to make your life easier.
That'd be great if you could do that.
It's and just for folks, if you like do it on your own, it's linked through the agenda. Here, I'll show you where. Oops. Whoever's meeting this is, could you allow me to screen share?
I'm trying to find it,
Okay,
but I will say,
fine.
while I do that, this presentation wasn't posted in advance because of circumstances beyond my control, but it will be posted with the meeting notes when I get them up. Okay.
That's great. Okay. All right. So
I can share here.
Yeah.
David doesn't have that.
I'm happy to do it.
Not until Brian stops sharing. All right. Well, perhaps.
So I'll just vamp for a second, folks, which is with the steering committee earlier this week, we looked at some of this additional guidance for subcommittees to help you all think about really what the tasks are ahead. So there's some clear sense of mandate and a clear alignment about what you want to be doing and how you're investing your time, right? And so also this guidance, what it does is it tries to signal how in each step of the process you can be using those just transitions guiding principles and how to do that practically and throughout this process that you're going to be doing in the next several months. And also signal some other resources that you can tap into. As I share my screen here in just a sec, what I really want to stress here, and by the way, you can click through it to right here on your agenda.
Like 10, no, quarter to 10.
John,
Oh
we
my
can
God,
hear you.
what a stress.
Hang on a second, John. Could
I
you put
left,
yourself on mute?
Or
could someone? There we go. Thanks. All right. So what we've tried to do is sort of sketch this out and build off some previous guidance, which you can click through right here. By the way, there's a previous bunch of guidance here that, again, we're trying to make short documents, like 3-page documents kind of thing. So it doesn't feel onerous to go through. But this new guidance here, what it really is all about is like understanding these stages of the work, understanding the support that'll be available, how to incorporate just transition principles, and then starting to wrap your minds around how any kind of prioritization can happen in the fall. Okay. So this is what this document's about. I'm not going to go through every word of it right now, but I will point out a couple things, and that is the stages. So we've divided up as through like 3 stages, and then there's a 4th stage that really is just the council. But the first stage is what you all are finishing up right now, which is getting started. And that's where you really need to identify these core issues you want to be working on over the summer and into the fall. And my strong recommendation to all of you is, I know you've done some of this work already. The council gave you some guidance about what it wanted back in its January meeting. And you just don't have oodles of time over the next few months to lean into this, even as you break up into some task groups to help do simultaneous work. So I would say my encouragement is pick your punches on this and really think about what it is you need to be studying, deliberating, and coming up with some ideas on for this update. All right. And don't get wrapped up in too much sort of, oh, we need detail on everything. I know there is the #1 bullet coming out of the council is they're looking at cross-sector mitigation to look across the economy and the different sectors and say, do we have a coherent strategy that makes sense to be aligned with what the Global Warming Solutions Act asks of us? So that really takes work because you're looking across each of the sectors. But as you do that, I would say really focus in on the handful of issues that aren't in the existing plan that would make a really big difference in an updated plan. And that just for your own sanity and the amount of work. So stage 1 is right, getting that down on paper of sort of, this is what we're going to be looking at. This is our plan. These are our meetings over the summer. This is how we're going to get to the fall and when we start prioritizing in the fall. All right. And here, facilitation resources are available. These are kind of tricky conversations. So Catherine's going to help out later. I can see she's joining now. And so this stage 1, and then stage 3 are the sort of best opportunities to tap into facilitation resources. And you all have a certain number of hours, which we'll let you know in shortly, but you have enough to handle a couple meetings like this. So feel that you can do that. And for just transition principles, instead of doing some major review at the end of all this, what we're encouraging folks is, as you're having conversations like you're going to have today, and as you get into your task groups, to really pull on this question, right? How do we understand today the status quo and any potential inequities that communities or different populations in the state are experiencing on these issues that we're working on, right? How do we understand those inequities today? And how do the current pathway strategies and actions from the initial cap address or not address those inequities, right? So having this conversation early, and this is your own best understanding. It's you're looking at the different inputs that's been into the process over the last several years. We now have quarterly engagement reports that we're sharing around where we're talking to frontline communities about different things. So this is what we're encouraging you all to do. And as you move into the summer, this is where you're deliberating, you're doing your work in the different sectors, you're really trying to laser in on what's going to make a big difference in the update. And what needs to be changed from the initial cap. And so that deliberation, again, you have some support, you support from folks like Brian or others on the modeling, and at least what the previous modeling tells you. The update that Brian talked about is not going to be ready for this work over the summer and into the fall. That'll be, Brian can correct me, but it'll be, late into the year, early next year kind of result. So you're not going to have the benefit of that. The council will, but there is existing modeling and existing data, and Brian can be helpful. And also the EAN reports is helpful. And then again, incorporating just transitions principles into this work in the deliberation over the summer One thing I want to shout out is there is a community engagement team working and out and doing focus groups and being in events. And so as you get into substance and you're looking for input, if you can channel through your co-chairs questions that you'd like the community engagement team to be asking, that team would be more than happy to start to weave those in to the kinds of work we're doing. So if you have specific things around transportation, around buildings, around whatever, let us know. Or through your co-chairs, let the community engagement team know. There's also going to be reports coming out about community engagement. The Q1 report is out. Q2 will be out shortly at the end of this month. Those will be good resources for you. And there's an opportunity to be attending events. There'll be a list of events that the Climate Action Office will start to circulate around subcommittee members and counselors. And if you would want to attend those events, you're more than welcome to. And then there's this other opportunity that your co-chairs can do to coordinate with Just Transition liaisons on your subcommittee, and perhaps even invite members of different communities to come be part of meetings and be part of your conversations. So these are all opportunities for doing stuff over the summer. And then as you are developing ideas and thinking through options in your task groups and in the full group, how are you addressing inequities that you've identified? Okay, and then the prioritization piece, just real quick, this, as we get into the fall, you'll need by, say, mid-September, late September, to have some draft ideas, even if it's still quite laundry listy. And you're going to need a more systematic approach to go through it. Cross-sector did that. And you all who participated in that last time will remember that you had a fairly effective system of prioritization based on impact on emissions reductions and some other variables. I think cross-sector is uniquely positioned to use that kind of analysis again. And so we have some thoughts about updating the way you did it last time around, but it's fundamentally for cross-sector, it's very similar. All right. That's all I wanted to share, and there's more detail. I want to stress one more time that, and by the way, there's actually an updated version of this that I'll make sure you all get. This is the one that's linked on the website right now, but based on the steering committee meeting, we just made a few updates to this. I want to stress the fact that the limited time over the summer and the importance of being selective in the things that are most important for you to invest your time. And I'd encourage you, as you set a set of meetings, both for your task groups and the overall subcommittee, that you are pretty rigorous about saying, on this date, we're going to work on these issues. The task group's going to have it ready for us to work on, and sequentially work through things so that you can show up by mid-September, late September, and have a draft set of recommendations that really hit at the key points. All right, that's me yapping for a while. Melissa, let me turn it back to you. And everyone, if there's questions about all this, and I see there are.
Yeah, thanks, David. I know you don't have endless time, but yeah, let's quick go through questions or comments on the guidance to the subcommittees. Joey, you wanna?
Thanks, David, and thanks for everyone who did that work. Just question for you, I mean, doing a lot of this work over the summer and then by September seems like a pretty compressed timeline. And it doesn't say anything beyond like what happens after November. So is the thinking that it's all the other things are happening in the council process? Because the draft plan, I didn't believe was due until July 2025. So I'm just curious why it's so compressed when feels like we've got a foundation to build from, but also curious.
Yeah, in the updated version of this, which is aligned with other guidance provided, I mean, the key in this process is trying to be attentive to things that folks were not that happy about last time we did this, which was we had to just like pull this plan together and put it out. And so there is a whole process working back from June 2025 to have a draft plan and to have some engagement around that plan and adapt that draft plan based on that engagement. So to get to a draft plan, you need to have the council by the end of this year consolidating all your work and creating a draft plan into January. So the only way that happens is if you all have draft recommendations starting in September, there's going to be a set of stakeholder conversations around those draft recommendations, even if they're not prioritized or anything, just like, hey, this is what we're working on. We need to get to September have some conversations about that. And then you all need to be prioritizing in October, November, so that all that can be up to the council in December, November, December, and turned into a plan that in the early part of the winter can then get out and have some public comment on it. That's the pressure time. So we're explicitly trying to back up from June to allow for a consolidated plan to be out there and to have some comment and be revised. Brian?
Yeah, thanks, David, for focus on the outreach component in particular. So just wanted to remind folks that there are 2 events next week, one Tuesday evening and one Thursday afternoon. Our communications coordinator, Selfie, would not forgive me if I didn't mention it. And then you and you should have emails inviting you to both of those events and to participate as you can. And as David said, if you have particular questions that you want to pose to participants of those, please forward them through your co-chairs. Like David said, this is a really critical part and a really critical time to get this engagement from the public.
Thanks, Brian. Gina?
Yeah, this is a question that always comes up with public engagement. I mean, when do we reconcile what we're hearing versus what the numbers and the analysis is telling us? And I always like to use the issue of transit because people always want more transit for many, many good reasons. Everything we've done so far, though, emissions reductions is not one of them. So how do we weigh that? If what the public is telling us, and this is what we heard in the past,
Right.
Everybody wants more transit for 100 really good reasons. All the work that VTrans did, all the work that we've done, doesn't tell us that transit will not reduce emissions in a meaningful way at the moment, or even in the foreseeable future. So how do we reconcile that?
Yeah. That's a dilemma.
It's a dilemma.
I can say one of the things, I don't know if you all know, but I help the Maine Climate Council do its work too, in doing Maine's climate action plan and very similar conversations. I think, Gina, the key thing for you all is to listen, right? And say, wow, there's a lot of interest in transit. Transit has a lot of benefits for a variety of reasons, right?
Huge. Huge.
And whether, you can name all those. And we need to, in addition to that, have a plan that is coherent with the emissions reductions requirements in the GWSA, right? Those two things don't need to be incompatible. They just need to be there in parallel, right? To say there's a lot of interest in transit, and where we can understand the emissions reductions is in this space over here. So we're going to have to, our recommendations are going to have to deal with both.
You will have to write that down and show that what we're talking about. There'll have to be explanations for all this stuff in the report at some point.
Right. Yeah.
For any number of issues that good issues that the public brings up, we have to acknowledge them and address them and with them. Okay.
Yeah.
And that will happen throughout the process or at the end.
So I'll just say, 30 seconds about the kind of engagement that's happening right now.
Okay.
So since about over the last 12 months or so, the Climate Action Office has been directing, with the help of the Consensibility Institute, a variety of different kinds of engagement particularly with frontline communities and communities that aren't typically involved in policymaking process. And so that's looked like a couple things. One, showing up at events where those populations and those communities gather anyway. And we've been doing a lot of tabling and talking to people and having that kind of informal engagement, getting people's contact information, weave them in. So showing up and being present. The other is we're doing focus groups with specific populations. We've focused so far this year around Vermonters who are linguistically diverse, who wouldn't show up because of a language challenge in a policymaking process. So we've been doing we've done 6 of those with interpretation support and everything. And we'll be focusing more of that effort around low-income Vermonters in this year. So that's going on. And also partnering with community-based organizations, particularly CAP agencies, but others as well, and working with them to how to spread out the conversations around climate action across the state in different corners with partners. And with CAP agencies, we'll be doing specific events working with low-income Vermonters. So all that's happening, and what happens with that information is it's getting consolidated into quarterly engagement reports. And increasingly, we hope also subcommittee members, counselors can join in certain of those activities. And we are happy to work with folks to prepare different community members to come participate in meetings as a constructive participant, bringing a perspective, someone who wouldn't normally show up in a meeting like this. So those are all the kinds of things that are happening. They're happening now, and they'll happen throughout the year. And also in the fall, we'll be organizing some what we call stakeholder small group conversations, which is focusing on sort of certain types of stakeholders, be they frontline communities or not, who would have a particular stake in the types of recommendations you're coming up with. So we did that, if you remember, 3-4 years ago.
Yeah.
We'll be doing that again.
And all those reports will be readily available to us on the website?
Yeah, readily available website is, still work in progress with that website. However, they are readily available, and we'll be circulating them, and increasingly we'll find a nice place for them to live on the website. They all are there. Whether they're readily accessible is another question.
So the chairs will be circulating them to us, or okay.
Yeah.
Good. We need to see that stuff.
Yeah. Thanks, Gina, for those questions.
Yep.
I thought I saw another hand from Christine. No, we're good. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, David. Any last minute questions or comments on the guidance to our subcommittee before we move on? Appreciate the discussion. I think just to summarize the takeaways from the guidance as I see them, really focus on gaps from the previous climate action plan, consider equity implications as we go through all stages at the initiation all the way through our development of recommendations, and really be strategic with our time. I'm hearing loud and clear that we do have limited time. So take a strategic focus on the areas where we're likely to see the biggest impact in GWSA compliance and on emissions. And the guidance document does specifically, of course, call out the transportation sector as a specific area of focus where they'll be looking for comprehensive recommendations from our subcommittee in the coming months. So again, thanks, David, for leading us through that conversation. Before we get into kind of the bulk of our work here, which Catherine's going to facilitate around our proposed work plan, I did want to get a quick update in the transportation space because, as we know, there's analysis going on that will happen concurrently with our subcommittee trying to come up with transportation recommendations. So Joey agreed to briefly update us on basically the scope of work for the VTrans analysis that's about to get underway.
Right. I'll try to be brief, and we'll ask Jared in particular, since Andrea Wright and Jane aren't here. But as we all know, harkening back to 2021, the Transportation Climate Initiative cratered as a cap and invest program. We embarked on more work and research and analysis, and then leaned into the carbon reduction strategy, which was required under the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, to look further at transforming transportation in an equitable multimodal way, and had hoped the CRS would have answered the questions that we need answers to more fully. There's more work to do, so we agreed, as people remember, as a climate council, to go further. We adopted a transportation addendum, said we should look at regulatory and policy tools to meet our GWSA requirements. The legislature essentially tracked that work, and in the T-bill sort of incorporated our recommendations in the transportation addendum to sort of enable the ongoing exploration of answering what is one or more policy or regulatory tools to make certain stepped and equitable progress. In the T-bill, the legislature added the state treasurer into that work to try and leverage, I think, the unprecedented federal funds that are coming down. And so now we have, under the leadership of VTrans, Andrea Wright in particular, and the Climate Action Office, have collaborated pretty quickly to put an RFP together to do that analysis, get us to the detailed information we need to assess, again, one or more policy or regulatory tools to reduce emissions in the transportation sector. V-Trans A&R issued an RFP, got 2 incredibly well-qualified teams of applicants comprised of a few different partners. And we put together a transportation advisory group, which is, I believe, comprised of 10 people, a couple members of V-Trans, members of the Climate Action Office, a few Climate Council appointees, a representative of the treasurer, and a couple members of the Just Transition Subcommittee. We reviewed the 2 applications. Again, both were really great. Lucky to have them. We each got 1 vote, and we lifted up 1 application to have a conversation with the applicants and explore further. And right now, what actually happened is, you probably remember, the A&R had used some of the carbon pollution reduction grant money to leverage that to undertake this analysis. Pretty clear that I think the dollars that they had appropriated to do that work would not be sufficient. So A&R, I believe, is willing to leverage other money to round out this analysis so that we can actually get the detailed information that we need to do that work. So that, again, the Transportation Advisory Committee recommended 1 preferred consultant, and now V-Trans and A&R are working to negotiate and execute a scope of work. And that scope of work will look at transportation cap and invest as a driver of significant transportation reduction progress, transportation cap and invest with an accompanying low carbon fuel standard. We'll also, using this opportunity to look at an economy-wide approach, so not just the transportation sector, but economy-wide, including thermal. And that also will ideally incorporate a low carbon fuel standard analysis. So that work is underway. A&R and V-Trans are negotiating with the consultant that the tech identified as a preferred consultant. And ideally, we're going to get the information that we need to make an informed assessment as cross-sector and as a full council as that work ramps. But it's a big lift, and I think the deadline that both consultants were willing to meet was to deliver final products by February of 2025 to inform the climate action planning process. So that's what I know, and I think Jared's the only other one here who was pretty involved in the tech meeting. So I don't know if you want to round that out, and Gina, if you have a question, I'll defer to you, Melissa.
Sure, yeah. Gina, go ahead. Or Jared, anything you want to add quickly? Yeah, okay. Gina, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of answered this question. It's just about the timing vis-a-vis what David just described. Sounds like we're going to be a little late.
Yeah, the timing doesn't align
Need that information
perfectly with what David laid out for the subcommittee work. So I think we're going to have to flex and adapt, considering transportation's our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Vermont, and we got to figure it out.
So the council will be made aware of that, or somebody will be. Obviously, because there are many council members on this committee. So, okay. Just wondered about that piece. I look forward to seeing the scope when it's made public.
Yeah, Christine, go ahead.
Question of clarification, Joey, that's all really helpful and good progress. On the economy-wide cap and invest that will look at both thermal and transportation under the new consultant that's hired, can you talk a little bit about, generally speaking, what the range of their scope will be? Will it be to assess how to do that and what next steps would be needed if Vermont chose that option, or would it be something different?
I do not believe it would get into the how to do it. I think the charge would be looking at what the emissions reductions would be. Brian, take a stab. You raised your hand.
Yes, I did, and it's not a stab because I do know. So the outline that we're dealing with right now is, or that we're working with the contractor right now, is what are the implications of Vermont participating in a cap and invest program for in the sectors that Joey described, either with New York, because they're developing one, and they're required under their scoping plan to actually develop one. They're behind schedule, or participation in the California, Quebec cap and invest. We're going to look at that both for the transportation, because both of those are going to be economy-wide programs. So we will look at that for just the transportation sector. We've had conversations. There are historical conversations with California and Quebec where they have said, yes, if you just want to participate just for your transportation sector, we believe that we can accommodate that. And also for transportation plus thermal fuels, and then potentially even stationary sources like full economy-wide. As Joey said, we're also going to look at what the using like a low carbon fuel standard as a complement to participating in that kind of a program, how that would augment it. That's what California does as well. And the things that we're talking about with the contractor are things like, so what would be the cost for Vermont's participation? What would be the what's the allowance price that would be on emissions? In a regional type of situation, either with New York or in with the WCI states, what are the emissions reductions that you would expect to see? Because they, unlike if we did it by ourselves, not all of the actual emission reductions in any sector might happen in any particular jurisdiction. They happen in the region. The cap becomes a regional cap, and the emissions reductions happen basically wherever they are the most cost effective. But we would be on a trajectory. We would have a budget. So we want the contractor to look at, if we're participating in that kind of a program, regional program, what would be our emissions reductions? What could they be on the target dates that we talked about earlier? And when might we be experiencing or seeing those emissions reductions that would comply with the GWSA targets? There's also optional elements regarding macroeconomic effects, and even a household study by like household quintile. What would be the the effects on particular households of participation and the change in fuels? Also, the power of the cap and invest is in the revenue that you raise and how you invest it. So looking at scenarios for particular investment scenarios for particular investment portfolios to be able to realize additional emissions reductions and how that could happen. So that's kind of a high level look. There's some options that we're talking about with the contractor. Really trying to nail down, if this study gets, at the end of the day, when this study comes out, is it going to be providing you folks, other policymakers, with the right information to be able to say, yeah, we think this is a direction that we want to go, and here are the implications, the benefits, and the the costs of that for doing this versus doing something else, and also versus the baseline.
Thank you. That's very helpful and very encouraging. No time like the present.
And we will be able to send around the scope of work. I'll defer to B-Trans as they negotiate and wrap that up, but I had understood they hope to do that very soon. And no time like the present is right. I think it was about a dozen years that Vermont participated with 11 other states and Washington, D.C. on TCIP, which cratered. So the goal is we got to be doing this as a state, as a region, as a nation. So let's get the answers that we need to do this in the most cost-effective, equitable way, but actually move forward with pollution reduction progress.
Yeah, Joey, making sure the task group, the transportation task group as it exists in this group is kept informed and gets that scope. And we have to decide what is that entity now, because I think I'm the only one that's not involved in that study who's left over from this group. I know. So, but I mean, I'm just thinking in terms of keeping this group informed.
Yeah, perfect.
Me specifically.
Thanks, Gina. And I think that's a good segue into the next portion of our
Okay.
agenda. But yeah, thank you, Joey and Brian, for giving a little bit more detail on the analysis that's underway. And, Gina highlighting that the timeline is not perfect, but we're going to hope to strive to keep those continued linkages between the task group and the analysis that's going on so that the ultimate recommendations that end up in the CAP are the most well-informed that they can be. So the bulk of our discussion today is intended to be focused on our essentially a work plan where the task groups can focus in the coming months, because coming out of our last meeting, you all indicated a preference to continue the task group structure to be more efficient with our subcommittee work. And we're going to get into membership kind of at the end, but wanted to have a little bit of a deep dive on what the charge to the task groups is and where the priority areas of focus should be, kind of building off of the subcommittee guidance that we've received from the Climate Council. And then, of course, recognizing the somewhat compressed timeline that we're working under with the goal of getting at least our draft initial recommendations done in September. So Catherine agreed to facilitate this portion of the meeting, and I did include in the meeting materials my first cut at what is a work plan. It's kind of a work plan charter hybrid. I did embed some background information there because, as David said, the council's putting out kind of short briefing documents to inform us. And I found it was helpful to have those all consolidated and linked in one document to kind of get our hands around what is cross-sector mitigation, what are our top priorities, and how are we going to move forward with the work. So Catherine, would you like me to share the document, or? Oh, you're muted, but I think you're saying yes.
Indeed. Yeah, I don't think I have the most recent version. So Catherine Morris, I'm a colleague of David Plum's, and I know some of you, and some of you are new. I've worked with the cross-sector mitigation group and as well as the council in the past couple of years. And yeah, so we're tag teaming because David had another commitment. So yeah, we're going to share your screen. And I think, maybe the best way, one of the things we wanted to just go over, I think the guidance was a pretty good introduction to what your task is as a subcommittee. But do you want to start by just talking specifically, Melissa, about the task to the task groups themselves? Because that creates another layer that want to make sure everybody understands what their responsibilities are at the task group level.
Yeah, and again, this is coming out of the conversation. Gosh, I have two screens. I could never have enough screens. But coming out of our conversation in May, as we wrestled with pros and cons of using the task group structure versus what conversations are most appropriate to have at the subcommittee level. Obviously, a clear desire from the subcommittee to have these focused areas to work, I think, essentially by sector, right? Electric, thermal, building and thermal, and transportation, as well as non-energy. But that, the indication that really decision-making should happen at the subcommittee level, in part due to concerns about transparency, public participation. So really the task groups are going to be charged with kind of conducting research, identifying, essentially taking guidance from the subcommittee around which areas we'd like further exploration in, doing some research in between our monthly meetings, and coming back with kind of policy analysis, pros and cons of different approaches. And then again, letting the decision-making responsibility still sit at the subcommittee level. So, to be determined, but I think this is kind of our last meeting before the summer work session gets off to a start. So cadence of subcommittee meetings will need to be decided. Cadence of task group meetings. And, kind of talking through at the subcommittee level, what assignments do we want to give the task groups, and what kind of expectations do we have for the work that will get conducted and carried out before our July meeting and then our August meeting, with the hopes that when we come together as a subcommittee in September, we really need to be at the stage of having a list of recommendations, and then prioritization will happen throughout the fall. So again, using the task groups as kind of the vector through which we'll dive into the details of potential policies and do some research and, most likely talk to some stakeholders as well.
Right. So I think the equity portion of that analysis is also starting at the task group level, if I'm right, Melissa. they should be thinking about and looking at those progress reports and thinking about what are the implications for equity, both for the existing programs and any new recommendations that you might come up with. So what we were thinking we would do is first just, now that we've sort of covered the general charge of the task groups, is talk a little bit about that timeline, taking David's guidance on where you need to be in September. I think we've only gone really through September, and test with you a proposed time frame that would require pretty frequent meetings of the task groups, monthly ongoing meetings of the subcommittee to take in the progress of the task groups. And then by September, the hope being that you've had a couple of subcommittee meetings, at least 4, if not 5 different task group meetings to bring forward, have the deliberation with the subcommittee and have them ready to bring forward to the council itself a draft set of, as I think David described it, as kind of a laundry list, so not prioritized, but at least a list of what you want the council to consider for options of amendments to the cap. So, Melissa, I don't know if you want to say anything more about this timeline. I think some of you in the task groups have perhaps, or the committee itself has already started to identify those gaps and taken guidance from the council on the priority areas you want to focus on, transportation being the big one. But you may still have some more work to do there. So we're assuming that at least if you wanted to meet again in June, you might, finish up that task of identifying the gaps and the priorities. Then in the June, September, again, we've outlined here the specific tasks, including the equity considerations. And there's more, I think there's more guidance in what David shared with you, but here I think are the main points that we wanted to raise and just make sure that there is an understanding of what the expectations are on a monthly basis. And I think you had in there at some point, if you scroll down, the task group expectations for the first July cross-sector, the next July cross-sector meeting. Melissa, I'm happy to let you walk through since you developed this document, and then we can sort of ask people how they feel about this pace of work and the expectations. One thing to note, as you guys have already said, not each of the task groups are going to be able to follow this in a prescriptive way, because you're not going to have the information you need to be able to necessarily start developing strategies. And maybe that means that you have to put more of your time and focus on the equity portion of the questions before you, looking at the existing, focusing more of your time and attention on the existing plan and what you would want to see changed or revised. But Melissa, what would you like to add just to inform people about what the expectation is, at least for that first step?
Yeah, well, I think the first piece, this was put together by me with the consultation with, the CBR partners at CBI, but, maybe some buy-in or level of commitment that folks are comfortable with. The proposal, I guess, would be bi-weekly meetings from the task groups over the summer. Again, we did the analysis or the review of the existing cap recommendations at our last meeting. We started getting into gaps, but, we definitely want to come out of this meeting with kind of clear direction, as in this is what the buildings and thermal task group should be focused on. This is where we expect the transportation task group to be doing its work. And then, again, getting this by, July, which is our next meeting, that there would be some additional analysis by the task groups that really focused on potential recommendations. And again, just I think what came through clearly to me in the guidance was this constant focus on equity and impacts of the recommendations and how we potentially mitigate those impacts on vulnerable populations. So I think the bulk of the discussion I wanted to have today was really centered on the table. but I guess I'll pause there and just ask, take the temperature of the group around participation. Most of you all have kind of already put your hands up and said, I want to participate in one or more task groups. So I just want to, again, take the temperature of the group on the meeting frequency and that level of commitment. And is that what you're expecting as a subcommittee member and participant?
Who's convening all these meetings? Scheduling them, announcing them,
That is a good
inviting us. Who's doing all that work? Is staff doing that work?
That is a good question. Brian, is that something the Climate Action Office is slated to do, or does that sit with the subcommittee itself and our task group leads?
I don't have a clear answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
To me,
Yeah.
that's critical. No, I mean, somebody's got to do that, or it won't happen.
I mean, as a default, we could assume that the task group leads would need to just do a doodle, find people's availability and schedule out the meetings, and then presumably also set, general agenda items. I think
And
Melissa,
take minutes and to set agendas, take minutes, facilitate the meetings, run the meetings. Okay, that's a lot.
I can say that we are in the process of recruiting for another position to help support the Climate Council, but we're not finished with that yet. And there'll be some capacity there, but I don't want to overpromise capacity for a position that we don't even have filled yet. So Jane can provide more information to you once we have more certainty. But I think you have it right that there's going to be some, additional responsibility. You have it right, Gina. There's going to be some additional responsibility at the co-chair level to do some of this organization.
and perhaps the task groups could decide to share that responsibility in some way, so it doesn't all fall on one individual. I mean, I think it's up to the task groups, but that's a possibility. Yeah, I didn't see whose hand went up, Bram and Christine. I don't know who was first, but.
Thanks, Christine. I'll just say, in the past, the task groups, I think, have not struggled particularly to do their own scheduling. To get to the end of a meeting and say, okay, who's, when are people available 2 weeks from now? And, I don't know, as the task groups, keeping notes, I think they don't need to be publicly warned, and the obligation to keep formal minutes is a lot lighter. We want to keep notes for our own use so we know what we did and what we're planning to do and what we've committed to. But we don't need to publish formal minutes. So I think it seemed to work pretty well in the past. I don't see why this round will be any different.
Christine?
All of the above. And for the buildings and thermal task group, at this point, I'm aware of David Farnsworth and myself offering to participate for the thermal sector as we did last time. And there may be one or two other people on this Zoom who also feel they've made that offer, but I don't want to speak for other people. And Dave's not here today, but I'm pretty confident of what I'm saying. And if there are any others who want to speak today or don't want to speak today, but if you could reach out to Dave and me, say by the middle of next week, to express interest in serving on the buildings thermal task group, that would be super helpful, because it's very apparent we need to get organized and get moving. Thank you.
And I will say the cursors over those two boxes, and I think that probably means someone's noticing that those two sets of people got switched. So thank you for correcting that, whoever is driving the cursor.
Exactly what I was going to say. Thank you very much.
Okay. One of the things that David mentioned is there should be some facilitation help. It's primarily for the subcommittee work. itself, not the task groups. But if, once he shares how much there is in the budget for that, maybe there could be room for some help, at least in planning the meetings, if not facilitating the task group meetings. So let's making a preliminary offer if there's time and budget there. So we're starting to fill out the actual task group volunteers. Christine, you and Dave were the leads, as I understood it before. Are you willing to be the lead again?
I would suggest that we convene as this time's task group. And I'm delighted to see Jared and Adam's name on that. I didn't happen to grab this particular memo before this meeting. I had the previous one, the additional guidance one. I suggest we gather and then we'll take it from there and we'll have a prompt answer to that question after our first formal meeting.
Would you be willing to at least do the scheduling for the first meeting, I guess?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. If that's what you're asking me, absolutely. No problem. Yeah.
Just to get started?
Yeah, totally.
And I guess there's the same question for transportation and electricity. Anybody want to step up and be willing to at least get you started on scheduling the first meeting and from there picking whoever you want to lead the group? Yeah, is that Joey?
Yep.
You volunteering?
Yep.
Great.
We did that before without logistical support, so we'll do it again. We'll figure it out and look forward to keeping broad cross sector posted. And when we have a moment, I just have a couple of questions about other components of this doc.
Liz, you're about to be bolded. Did you volunteer for?
No, no, actually I didn't. I was gonna just raise an issue with the electricity one. I think TJ, someone remind me, Melissa, we need to address that. And then second, it's just kind of a overview question, depending upon, I guess, what happens next week at the ledge. I'm just not sure that we have the same scope or correct membership. Certainly the three of us would be appropriate people on there, but I'm not sure about TJ and I'm not sure if we need broader membership. And I'm not exactly sure what we're doing given the legislation that was recently passed, though I know it's subject to vote next week.
Yeah, all good points, Liz. So TJ is interested in continuing to serve on this task group. He's confirmed that. And yeah, you'll see renewable energy standard is like in bold and italics, right? Because we have one and there's a proposed one that we will hopefully know more about within a week. So all three of the task groups are, I think, in very different places regarding what their charge is from the subcommittee. And we're just going to have to stay on top of conditions as they evolve. Coming out of next week, I think it certainly would make sense for the electricity task group to convene after we know the disposition of the renewable energy standard bill.
And we can talk about that more specifically, each of these groups and their charge. And while we're here, Bram, you raised your hand. Did you want to volunteer to be in a group or?
That must have been a stray hand.
Okay, I saw a physical hand. Joey, you said you had some bigger questions.
Well, just thank you. That is it our charge to sort of round this out as a task group in terms of identifying the gaps and identifying the key stakeholders, data needs. This is like our work plan as a task group, this document. And then to get to the priorities, the laundry list. Is that accurate?
I'd say this is intended to be the high level direction that the subcommittee wants to give to the task groups. And then you may need a more detailed work plan or more detailed documents to govern that work. But this is really like, what do we as a subcommittee want the transportation task group specifically to be looking at? And who do we think need to be on that stakeholder list? Yeah, so I think this is a starting point, but certainly not a full work plan for the task group.
Great. Well, I would welcome in the transportation space any other specific ideas if people wanted to offer them now. I'd also just say, like, for example, on in the buildings and thermal, I am gonna defer to the team, you know, highlighted here, but in terms of like key stakeholders, I would certainly really critical to reach out to the equity advisory group. I would hope that they'd be reaching out to the technical advisory group as well. And then under equity considerations, we're gonna round all that stuff out, but equity considerations, cost impacts, and, you know, potential benefits, just wanting to make sure like we're all sort of looking both similarly, but also differently because of the different sectors have different equity considerations. So I was just trying to answer the question of how do we co-craft this together, and if that's happening today or beyond. And you sort of just answered it, Melissa, but
Yeah, thanks, Joey. And I'm happy to edit as we go. I mean, really, this is a working document, and in terms of crafting it today, yes, just because we felt like when I looked at the guidance to the subcommittee, I realized how compressed that timeline is, and that the work really needs to happen in the before our July meeting. So this won't be a perfect, you know, consensus document, but really like give the task groups enough to get started. And I have no idea what order in which these hands came up. I don't know if Catherine's watching.
No, I did not notice either. So just going from the top of my screen, Gina, and then Christine. And
Yeah, the last time around, we made an effort to bring in a lot of transportation professionals into our conversation. But are we keeping these groups small within the context of the Climate Council and the task force, and not try to reach out because that's going to happen somewhere else?
I don't think there's anything preventing you from reaching out. I mean, for instance, the transportation, they're obviously going to want to work closely with whoever the contractor is developing the analysis of the options. You've already also been invited, and you could do this either at the task group level or the committee level to, you know, invite some of the community level individual stakeholders that are being engaged to talk to you. So I get the impression that that's an open door.
I mean, there's all kinds of people who are in the business of delivering transportation, and we should be reaching out to them. And whether it happens within the context of this task group or somewhere else, you know, I'm not sure. But there must be true in other arenas too that we're dealing with, from buildings and thermal, the business of retrofitting buildings. You know, where do those people get engaged? Those interests get engaged.
I would say that is up to the task group as to what you feel like that kind of sort of falls under the data needs, what you feel like you need in order to provide informed advice to the subcommittee.
Okay.
So I don't think there's anything preventing you. I'll just put it that way.
So that will be on us. Yes.
Christine?
This is a little bit down in the weeds, but it's the level of clarity that would be helpful for somebody in my role, at least for me. We were asked to take a look at the progress report and that of how the states defined how we're doing compared to last time's recommendations. And as folks may recall, we developed pathways at a very high level, and then we had strategies underneath each pathway by sector. And so I just want to encourage us to build from the framework we used last time and use common messaging, unless we know that we're going to report this stuff all out in a very different framework than before. So when I see suite of recommendations on the screen in front of me, I automatically, when I want to think about applying it to the thermal sector work, which we've done before, I'm thinking about it as are the pathways, the high level 2 pathways that we proposed and served as an organizing framework in the past climate action plan still accurate and effective? And if not, how do they change? And then within each strategy proposed for achieving each separate pathway, are those still relevant? What have we done on them? What's missing? What needs to change? So I just wanted to share that right up front, because I felt like it took us a while last time to get to the clarity of why a high-level pathway was relevant in climate action planning, and then why we needed more specific actionable strategies to support achieving that pathway. And unless there's a reason to change that way of thinking, which took us quite a while to get to last time, I hope we continue to use it, or you tell us right away how it's changed so we don't have to redo work. Sorry to be so self-interested, but we've been around this block before.
I'm assuming that would be guidance that would come from the council, and have they not given you that guidance yet as to what the structure would be? The overall structure, whether it would be similar or not? No.
Kath, I mean, I do think that there is additional detail on the exact format that the revised plan will take, but certainly in our most recent council meetings, we have framed and described this as an update to the existing plan that will utilize and build upon the existing framework.
And I will add that at the steering committee, we have not heard any concerns or suggestions for changes or improvements to the pathway strategy action framework. So I think it is very safe to say that's the framework we will be using going forward.
Then just to sort of close it out, I would appreciate it if those who are helping create these overarching guidance documents to us like this, which is super helpful, would embrace the core architecture of the past framework that we're going to be working again within as soon as physically and intellectually possible.
Good point. Sam, let me go back up to you.
Thanks. Sorry. I take it in slightly different direction, so don't mean to get the conversation too off topic, but I appreciated just the expansion already of under equity considerations of just, I saw cost impacts alone or costs alone. I think it was, over what time frame and to whom specifically. And I think there's some room there. And I don't know if we're going to develop that together or if that's something, could provide some suggestions on coming from the Just Transitions Committee. But also perhaps that could include equity considerations could include, an identification step for each of the task groups of just like who are the frontline communities for each topic that's being discussed. Just a quick sort of like, even if it's a quick conversation, just so everyone's on the same page of who they might need to focus on or make sure that they're not leaving behind as they go on with the rest of their work. Then the other question, which may sort of fit under data needs, but it's sort of a different tact a little bit, is that would just be, is there any question that could be asked in community engagement that would help that task group or the subcommittee move forward in this specific priority area of focus? So feedback from the general public or specific communities in general, that could be really helpful to decide on sooner rather than later as the community engagement folks sort of plan out the rest of their work. So if there's something really specifically, whether it's like barriers to participation in certain something, I see like weatherization on here or whatever it is, that could be really helpful to do sooner rather than later. And then the last thing was just, I don't know as a liaison what my participation would be expected to be in these or not, which is also fine. But I would consider buildings and thermal or electricity if that should be useful.
Melissa, is it okay for Sam to join one of the groups? I don't know what your protocol has been on that.
Yeah, I don't think we've had restrictions on participation. I think these are open subcommittees. I know there's some desire to keep them. So yes, Sam, I think you'd be valued on either of those. And we've not gotten any guidance that this needs to be restricted to just subcommittee members. And I think you are a subcommittee member as a liaison. A little fuzzy on the details, but thank you. And the only desire to keep them small is to keep them effective, but also we want to have a breadth of voices. So there's a balance there. So sorry, I'm monitoring the chat. You just said buildings and thermal, Sam, potentially.
Yeah, or electricity if that's getting bigger, either one.
Or both, I don't know.
Both might be a bit of a load. 4 meetings a month, 5 meetings a month. Bram, I think you're up next, and then Joey.
Yeah, just wanting to to add more to what Sam added to the equity considerations. You know, I always think about, in addition to the cost impacts and the benefits to the health impacts and economic opportunities, as two really important factors that we need to think about as we think about where we clean the air up first and who gets the jobs doing it.
And I think there is in the guidance, I mean, the guidance that David shared, there's a lot of reference to the just transition principles to be your guide there. And I'm assuming that there's more guidance within that about what these considerations should be. So I think this is shorthand for, you know, taking into account all the possible impacts, both negative and positive, as you're pointing out, Bram. Joey?
I don't want to derail this conversation either, but I do wonder around some of this stuff and on this document in general. A couple of things I'm thinking about is, well, on this document, we do talk about workforce. I'm just trying to think about some of the wraparound key pieces that are critical and or helpful. And one thing that I'd like all of the task groups in the subcommittee to think about is, well, A, workforce, but B, leveraging the federal funding available, like, and maybe the task groups, you know, trying to wrap their head around what buckets of money are out there to support and help offset any upfront costs. As we know, you know, subsidies for fossil fuels are embedded in the US tax code, and it's a very different dynamic for cleaner, more cost-effective things, but we have this unprecedented opportunity with the Inflation Reduction Act and beyond. I'd love the task groups and the cross-sector to be thinking about that. And or how is the Climate Council thinking about that? That seems like an opportunity or that I wouldn't want us to leave on the table or need if we don't think about things like workforce. And I'm just not sure where that fits. So I'm putting it out here.
Yeah, I mean, workforce was drawn from the council's guidance earlier in the year. They wanted you to be thinking about the workforce constraints.
I guess
Funding,
my point is no one's really holding that body of work as far as I know. And so I'm just sort of, where should we as a task group and as a cross sector potentially try to do that via the sectors we're thinking about? But I don't know.
I don't know, Melissa, based on our conversations with David and your review of the documents, is that something that, I mean, is it more at the task group level just to identify those constraints to the extent that they have that information and take it up along with their options as part of the pros and cons? I guess that's where I would see it, but I don't, you know, I don't know if it's better to be a discussion that's had at the committee level.
Yeah, I think, you know, Joey, in terms of who owns it, I think it is the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee kind of has been assigned by the council looking at workforce. And so I think this document is really, again, intended to guide the task groups. So saying to the task groups, to what extent is workforce a constraint in your specific area of focus? We know in the buildings and thermal area that it is, right? Like we already know that, but to the electric sector, to what extent is that a limiting factor in meeting our climate goals and requirements? And same in transportation. I'm more familiar with the buildings and thermal sectors, which is why it popped up on here. And then to elevate that discussion to the subcommittee as a whole. And are we talking about a cross-cutting policy recommendation, or are they sector specific, depending on the extent to which they show up in the different sectors?
Graham.
Thanks. I just want to offer a very quick clarification that actually Jared pointed out in a previous meeting, which, you know, we've talked about task groups making recommendations to the subcommittee where the decisions are, but in fact, the decision of the subcommittee is making is what recommendations to make to the council. The council is actually our only decision-making body. I just wanted to remind everyone of that.
Well, we wanted to spend maybe the next 10 minutes, which is what we have left, to actually get feedback from the subcommittee to the task groups on what you would like to see them focusing on, and make sure that, you know, the things that you think are important, like Joey's just brought up, like funding, if that's important, to kind of continue that conversation. But let's, you know, maybe take it on a task group by task group basis. So, for instance, on buildings and thermal, here the clean heat standard is called out. There are other recommendations within the CAP beyond just the clean heat standard. But wanted to hear from the other members of the subcommittee, any guidance you want to give to that group about what you think they should be focusing on, considerations that they should take into account. Any advice for them?
You're making our job easy, folks.
I'll just say that I have been facilitating the technical advisory group for the clean heat standard. And I know that, you know, they are addressing all of the many complex decisions that have to be made to make recommendations to the Public Utility Commission about how it could be designed. So I wouldn't see that as your work. But I can see as your work, you know, the complementary policies that would support the clean heat standard, particularly if there are equity considerations that you want to make sure are addressed. Whether that's, you know, assistance for, you know, upgrades to electrical panels, things like that. But because they're not necessarily going to be looking at that. So Bram, any other comments you want to make?
Yeah, so you know, certainly I mean, I know there's a ton of work going on a lot of fronts, but I do wonder about whether it's worth that task group spending time on building codes for new construction, and in particular, you know, whether we want to recommend things like no more chimneys as a possible building code. So it's a question. I don't know a great deal about it, but it feels like the codes probably will have a long-term effect on, since once you build a building, it tends to be there for a long time. And anything new we build, we want to have it be the way we want it 100 years from now, as well as today. And the other thing is, and we've talked a little bit about it, I don't know exactly where it fits in, but equipment performance standards. I know David talked about it a bit for heating and cooling equipment in particular, but those are two things that I would hope are on the list to decide whether to think about or not.
Great.
Yep, and they both were on the list last time too, so duly noted. And there's stuff to report in advance and adjust, informed by what's happened through policy programs or market activity since then.
Okay, transportation. Joey, you are the one who brought up, so I think questions about how to proceed, given that you have this study, results aren't coming out immediately. Thoughts about what the transportation group should be doing, in what order, or what they can be doing, particularly on the equity front while they're waiting for the study.
And that input is always welcome. Does not have to be in this very moment, so, but please do share.
Well, I think we need to refine the suite of recommendations. I mean, there's two in the box there, and we know that Cap and Invest and the low carbon fuel standard will be studied. But what about everything? What are we doing with everything else that's in there? There's a lot more in there from last time around. Do we just leave that in there and say, this is the new stuff? I don't want to get to January and then suddenly have this big job to put a report together.
No, I mean, part of your charge in the guidance is that you have to review the existing programs and decide whether there are things that need to be taken
Okay.
added, revised.
Okay, so I would say, you know, what you just look at what's in there, and then the two items that are there, I would add the clean fuel standard, which will be looked at, not just cap and invest, as was described by Joey and Brian.
I'm curious if the folks that are on that committee have ideas about, your first meeting. What would you talk about, given that you're waiting? So would it be the existing programs without really knowing what new ones
Yes, we would review what's in there now. Figure out what needs to come off, what needs to stay, what the emphasis will be. I mean, obviously, a huge part of it will be the results of the report. But then there are other things, from smart growth to transit to many other things. We have a lot of new information from the carbon reduction strategy that needs to be incorporated. For example,
might go into data needs. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, reviewing the carbon reduction strategy that was undertaken by VTrans and pulling out the parts that are relevant to this plan.
Joey, then Bram, and then.
I mean, I just was gonna say the same thing, and I feel like we're gonna review the CAP recommendations, the carbon reduction strategy. Frankly, I personally will be dusting off, Governor Douglas had a climate action plan from 2007. Governor Scott put a climate council together, 2017, 2018, a lot of work and thought was done on transportation. Looking at other rural states, Maine, David just mentioned work in Maine. I think we should I plan to take it upon myself to do a little bit of research and invite others to do the same, although people are very time constrained, but I think we should be reminding ourselves of the work that has been done, what others are doing in similar climates and places, and put good ideas on the table.
Maybe I'm going to say one more thing and then I'm going to let Brian talk. The one thing that's not on the side list, and maybe this is what Joey was getting at, it's the economic effects of these proposals, both to the state budget, to jobs. Well, there is workforce there, but to the economy writ large, to households. Where does that all come in here? I mean, workforce is jobs, I suppose. But what's one part of the job?
Any considerations should take in certainly households and job opportunities, and because it's both benefits.
So all economic, all things economic will be included in this report, I assume. To bring money into the state, to save people money, save households money. Cap and invest will bring money into the state budget.
Yep, I think anything that you think is.
So anything like that, there's no consistency throughout the report. I'm looking at the column on the left.
Sorry, on the work plan column on the left?
Yeah. ID gaps, key stakeholders, data needs, equity considerations and principles, workforce considerations. Can we have economic considerations there anywhere?
I think we can.
Am I just stating the obvious? Am I just stating the obvious?
No, I think that's important. I think this was intended to reflect the specific guidance the council had given us, but I think what I heard David say earlier was the piece around kind of prioritization and evaluating the recommendations around what kind of impact they will have. I think that is the next step, and maybe folks from last time can remember, but like GHG reduction potential, feasibility, technical feasibility, et cetera, et cetera. I think there was an existing framework for all of the cap recommendations that will then be applied maybe throughout the fall and into the winter. And I think David said that might be under review or for revision. But I think there's a framework that is consistent.
As usual, I'm getting ahead of myself here.
So, want to be sure we get the last couple of comments and then at least any advice you might have for electricity before we go to public comments. Bram and Jared.
So on transportation, I think one thing we can do as we await the results of the study in February are to game out a little bit. I mean, there aren't that many scenarios. There's New York, there's Western Climate, and there's Performance Standard. And we can think a bit about the implications. You know, if the results of the study very clearly lean towards recommending one or the other of those, you know, in each case, what are the implications for our work and for March, April, May, June, and those things. So that might be good to think about before the day that it happens.
Thanks. And then Jared.
Thanks, Catherine. I wasn't going to give a specific suggestion on a sector, but wanted to help populate that blank row around data availability and needs, because I think there's a few things that will be relevant across the board. And I would defer to Brian on the first thing that I'll mention, but my understanding from our conversations on the Science and Data Subcommittee is that there will be a new greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecast that is intended to be published in a matter of weeks, not months, and would provide an additional year of data going through 2021, so we can look at emissions in across the economy and then in each of these specific sectors. In complement to that, EAN has been analyzing tax department data, which is available on a much shorter time frame than some of the other sectors, to look at transportation and thermal fuel sales and emissions on going through through 2023. And so I will be able to share resources, and we're going to continue to do work to try to have more real-time emissions estimates for the energy sectors. So we'll make that available. And then I think the other key thing is the business as usual and pathways updates that are going to be continuing. As Brian mentioned earlier, I think those are three key grounding pieces that are relevant across all of these task groups. And then there's, some that there are certainly additional ones that are specific to the task group or sector, but I think those three will be helpful across the board and helpful to coordinate with Colin and others on the Science and Data Subcommittee about providing what will be most useful.
Thanks. Great. Couple minutes to share your thoughts on the electricity sector. Liz said, what are we going to do if the renewable energy standard doesn't pass? Thoughts about that? Yes, Sam.
This is perhaps more of a IDing a gap versus an answer to your question, but ahead of the last renewable energy standard update, Public Service Department, working with the RPCs, did do like a region by region public outreach, and I encourage folks. There were reports that were both on every region across the state, summarizing those results, and then also one the Public Service Department put out. I know that the report sort of came out later than the legislative session could have perhaps utilized it. So but there's a lot of good stuff in there. And I think one of the key things that I noticed was the sort of gap in addressing local reliability and resilience in our energy infrastructure. And I think it's a key piece of moving forward. And again, I understand this is maybe a little bit smaller scale, but I do think that would be valuable to consider.
Great. Liz.
Yeah, Sam, I appreciate hearing those comments. That public engagement report and material, including like a bunch of, I think even some of the recordings can be had through the RPCs in towns. That's a bunch of really good stuff. So we should put that on for people's awareness for sure. And on your second point, it feels like we're TBD until we kind of hear what happens next week in terms potentially about mitigation. But your point on local reliability and resilience, it may be that electricity wants to consider a coordinated subgroup with the rural resiliency adaptation folks more so. I know this is cross-sector and our topic is mitigation, but we may want to think about how, if we have developed a suite of recommendations that are supported in legislation on the mitigation side, whether we actually refocus the work toward the adaptation and resiliency side. I'll stop there.
Yeah.
And I'll sign off soon. Sorry.
And we actually, just to recognize there's big holes there on the non-energy, Peter Walcase had been the kind of the lead on that. We understand from our conversations that ANR will take the lead on that going forward. So we don't necessarily need a task group on that. Is that your understanding, Melissa, from talking to Jane, that they are going to be moving that forward from here?
Would defer to Brian on that. Is that?
All right.
Well, we will follow up. We will follow up with ANR. We're not going to stand up a task group today, so I will follow up offline because I know we're running short on time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it'll pop up on next month's agenda.
So public comment.
Yeah, I want to make sure we have a couple minutes for public comment. I know several people have a hard stop at 2, and we do have a few others on the phone. So is there anyone here who'd like to offer public comment for the subcommittee? Okay, not hearing any right at the moment. So I think we're just at our wrap up and next steps. We have our next monthly meeting scheduled. It sounds like we have leads identified for at least 2 of the task groups to schedule meetings in the interim. Liz, I will circle back with you and or TJ about the electricity subcommittee.
That's fine. Once we know more.
I guess a week from now, we'll have more clarity on next steps for that sector.
Great.
Okay. Thanks everybody for the time and the discussion today.
Thank you. And Melissa, will you send this updated around when you can? This is great. Appreciate it.
Great point. Will do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
All right.
Everyone.